Hello students, this video is going to identify the structures of the skull for you. This is the list that I provided for you in class, and I'm going to go directly down the list so that it's easier for you to follow along with me. So the first item on our list is the frontal bone. This is the frontal bone here. The next item is asking about sinuses. Your sinuses are going to be located back in this portion, but because it's not visible on the skull, you will not be asked to identify it on this model. The coronal suture is next. So here's your frontal bone. These are your two parietal bones. The suture that runs between them is going to be your coronal suture. Next item is the glabella. The glabella is the bone that's going to be in the center of your eyebrows. So when you frown, you can actually see this bone look like it's poking out, but this is your glabella. Parietal bones are going to be the two bones that are on either side of your sagittal suture, which is the suture that runs down the center of the parietal bones and connects to the coronal suture. I've already identified the two parietal bones for you. Next is the sagittal suture, which runs down the center. Your lambdoid suture is going to be on the back. So this is your frontal bone, your parietal bone. Your occipital bone is going to be on the lower back. The lambdoid suture is the suture that runs straight across and attaches the parietal bones to the occipital bone. Let's see. Squamous suture, which is a little hard to see because I've disconnected the top portion of the skull. But this suture here is going to be the suture that attaches the parietal bones to the temporal bone. So if it was attached, you would actually see that that suture runs right across here at the top. Next is asking about diplo. So you see these little tiny holes that are located in the skull. Those tiny holes are spongy bone. The spongy bone in the skull that's in between the compact bone of the skull. So the outer portions are going to be the compact bone. The porous portion is the diplo. Bregma is an intersection of your sutures. So your bregma is going to be the spot where the sagittal suture and the coronal sutures meet here in the center. To me, it kind of forms a T. So it's the front T. Lambdoid is going to be where your sagittal suture and your lambdoid sutures meet. So that point here, which forms a T in the back. So the T in the back is the lambdoid suture. Vertex is going to be the uppermost portion of the skull. So where my comb is, usually it's the place where the male pattern baldness will occur. If you look at your skull, there's a tiny little hole on most of them, just to kind of give you a reference point of where the vertex would be. I have mentioned the occipital bone, which is located on the back. The next item on the list is the occipital condyles. Condyles are going to be a place where articulation occurs. This is going to be where the skull articulates with the cervical bones of the vertebrae. So here, right here on either side of your magnum foramen or foramen magnum is the opening. Those little bumps on either side is going to be your occipital condyle. I did already identify the magnum foramen. Next is your external occipital protuberance. Okay. So here is a little bump on the back of the occipital bone. If you actually put your hand behind your head, you will feel where it sticks out in the back. So that is your external occipital protuberance. The internal occipital protuberance to me looks like a snow angel because you have your body here, your two legs, and your arms. But that bump here in the center is going to be the internal occipital protuberance. The clivus is like a slide. So this bone here in the center is going to be the sella turcica. on the back side of the sella turcica, entering down into the magnum foramen, is your clivus. So the clivus is the slide on the back of the sella turcica that enters into the magnum foramen. Your temporal bones is on either side of the skull. There's a portion of the temporal bone that attaches with the zygomatic bone, forming your zygomatic process. The external acoustic meatus, it's going to be this small hole here. This is your styloid process. Just above the styloid process is going to be your external acoustic meatus. All right, so your internal acoustic meatus is going to be this tiny hole here. So this bone is the petrous portion. It's kind of like a mountain in the center of the skull. This is going to be your sphenoid bone, frontal bone, the occipital bone. So the petrous portion is in between the occipital and sphenoid bones. And then again, that tiny hole that's at the top here is going to be your internal acoustic meatus. Styloid process, again, is going to be this tooth-like bone here. All right. I told you the petrous portion, jugular foramen. So if you go back to your petrous portion here, this is your internal acoustic meatus. There's a little bean-shaped hole just below that. That is going to be the jugular foramen. If you were looking at it from an internal view, you would see it here and here. It's on either side of the magnum foramen. You can also identify it from underneath. If I can get in focus. Okay, so this is also your jugular foramen here. Carotid canals, if you're on the underside of your skull. Let me stand up. All right, so this is your jugular foramen, which is that opening. The carotid canal is going to be that small hole located just above it, where the tip of my comb is. That is the carotid canal. All right, your zygomatic process is going to be this little bridge that forms between the temporal bone and the zygomatic bone here. Mastoid process. You can use the styloid process as a reference point. The mastoid process is this bump here. It's just below the external acoustic meatus, or just behind it, I should say. And then your styloid process is here. The mandibular fossa is going to be the part of the skull where the mandible articulates with the skull. So that's this portion here. So right here is your styloid process. Just in front of that is the mandibular fossa. And then your external acoustic meatus is here to kind of give you a reference point of where that is located. Try not to get too close so you all can see it. All right, so the next item on our list is the sphenoid bone. It does kind of have like a bat shape. This would be like the little head and the eyes, and those are your wings. So this whole portion here is sphenoid. Your greater wings are going to be these grooves that are down in the sphenoid bone. Your lesser wings are going to be this portion up here. This is going to be your lesser wings. The anterior clinoid process are going to be the tips here of the lesser wing. That's your anterior clinoid process. All right, let's go to the next page. The sella turcica. To me, the sella turcica kind of has like a square shape because it is the center portion of the sphenoid bone. So this part here is going to be your sella turcica. It actually has several parts to it as well. So this part here, think of the sella turcica as a seat, the seat of a saddle that you would place on a horse. So the dorsum soleil is going to be the back of the seat that kind of sticks up. Let me turn it to the side a little bit. All right, so if you think about the sella turcica like a saddle seat, again, the back portion is going to be the dorsum soleil. The posterior clinoid processes. So I just told you that the anterior clinoid process is here in the front. The posterior is going to be on either side of the dorsum soleil. So it's like the tips of the dorsum soleil. The hypophyseal fossa is the seat of your saddle. So how the bone curves, that curvature is going to be your hypophyseal fossa. The optic canals can be seen from on the interior portion of the skull. So these two little holes here are going to be your optic canals. They are also visible here. So that is the superior orbital fissure. Just to the inside of that is where you're going to see your optic canal, which is going to be located on either side of the skull. That little tiny hole that's up there. All right. Superior orbital fissure is what I just identified for you. So that's that slit that's going upward on either side of the optic canal. The medial and lateral pterygoids. Okay. So, I'm going to hold this up. All right. So here's your pterygoid bone. It is the place where your pterygoid muscles will articulate, but the portion that's on the outside is going to be the lateral pterygoid, and the portion here that's on the inside is going to be the medial. Remember, the medial is the part that's closest to the midline of the body. Okay, ethmoid. So here, again, is your frontal bone. In the center of the frontal bone is where you're going to find your ethmoid bone. It actually does go right in the back of where the nasal cavity will start to form. All right, so to me it kind of looks like a little arrowhead because it's a little triangular shaped portion. Within the ethmoid you have your perpendicular plate, which is in the nasal cavity. B is the crista galli. So you kind of see like this little bubble that's sticking up in my arrow. That is the crista galli. The cribriform plate would be on either side of the crista galli. It's usually a little porous. You'll see little tiny holes there. Perpendicular plate. So when you're looking on the inside of your nasal cavity, it's hard to see, but there's a fused bone here. This bone here in the center. The top portion is going to be the perpendicular plate. The bottom portion is going to be the vomer. This little curved bone on either side is going to be the middle nasal concha here. Excuse me, I'm sorry, y'all. And then the bottom portion is going to be the inferior nasal concha. All right, the maxilla. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going too fast. Nasal bone. Okay. So this is your nasal bone right here. You'll see like there's a little line going down the center of it, and it's just this top immediate portion is going to be the nasal bone. The lacrimal bone is going to be the bone here, either side of your nasal bone, and then your lacrimal fossa is where you'll find that little hole that's located here. So this is your lacrimal bone, and then that is your lacrimal fossa. The zygomatic bone, it's going to be your cheekbones. It does ask that you identify the processes. I will not ask you the processes on your test, but I will go ahead and identify them for you. So your frontal process is going to be this portion here, the slender part that goes up. Next is your temporal process, which is going to be the part that articulates or fuses with the temporal bone here. So that's the temporal process. Maxillary process is the part of the zygomatic bone that is fused with the maxilla. And then your orbital plate is going to be the part here that's going to be located in your orbital canal. All right, so your maxilla is going to be the upper portion of your mouth. This whole bone here is the maxilla. The alveolar margins, it's going to be your gum line. So where the teeth and the maxilla meet, if I were to put something here in the center of that portion here is going to be your alveolar margin. The palatine process. So this is your palatine bone. The palatine process is either side of where this line is. It's palatine process. The anterior nasal spine. So going back to the front, we said that this middle portion, the top half is the perpendicular plate, the bottom half is the vomer. This part that is sticking out here at the bottom of your nose, that is going to be your anterior nasal spine. So that anterior nasal spine is attached to the vomer. All right, so next is the mandible. So this is your mandible bone, which is the bottom portion of your mouth. On the mandible, you have the ramus. The ramus is the flat side portion, kind of like, I think they refer to it as the arm-like portion of the jaw. Next is the condyle. It may be referred to as the condylar process in some books, but the condyle of the mandible is going to be here. The coronoid process is going to be the front portion. So the condylar and the coronoid. The angle is going to be this curved portion here at the bottom. So you have your ramus, you have your angle, and then this bottom half is going to be the body. So this is your body here. Mental foramen. So on the front of the mandible, you're going to see two little tiny holes. Tilt it a little. These little tiny holes are going to be your mental foramen. Foramens are also always going to be an opening. And then on the inside here is going to be your mandibular foramen. If I hold that up just a little for you. So you see those little tiny holes on either side? That's the mandibular foramen. All right, everything else that's on your list I've already identified. I hope that you find this video helpful. Then I'll see you in class soon.